And that's when Margaret realized she'd been talking to the wallpaper pattern for the better part of an hour. The little blue flowers blurring together like they always did when she was trying not to cry. But crying felt too easy now, too familiar, like an old sweater she'd worn threadbare. She shifted in the armchair, the one Robert had reupholstered in 1987, insisting on that ghastly floral print because it matched the curtains Margaret had already grown to hate. Funny how you keep things just because someone you love chose them. Funnier still how those things outlast the people. Mrs. Chen, the social worker's voice was gentle, practiced, the kind of gentle that came from training videos about elderly clients. You were telling me about the documents. Margaret nodded. When though she wasn't sure she'd been telling her anything coherent, time moves strangely these days. Yesterday felt like 10 years ago. 10 years ago felt like yesterday. The morning Diane had walked into her kitchen with that smile. God, that smile, that felt like both. She brought coffee, Margaret said. The expensive kind from that place downtown. I should have known something was wrong. Diane never spent money on anyone but herself. Not since she was 16 and discovered credit cards. The social worker, Amy, Emma, wrote something down. Margaret wondered if it mattered what the woman's name was. She wondered if anything she was saying mattered, or if this was just another procedure, another form to fill out, another way the world had of making you feel both invisible and overexposed at the same time. And it was a Tuesday, Margaret continued, because once you started confessing, really confessing, it was hard to stop. I remember because that's the day my neighbor Alice does her gardening, and I could hear her clipping the hedge through the window. Clip, 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 like a metronome, like a countdown. Diane had worn her navy suit that day, the one she wore to client meetings, she'd once explained, because it made her look authoritative but approachable. Margaret had been proud of that suit once, proud that her daughter had the kind of job that required power suits and leather briefcases and lunches that cost more than Margaret spent on groceries in a week. She said she'd been thinking, Margaret said. That's how she started. Mom, I've been thinking. As if thinking was some generous gift she was bestowing on me. The coffee had been too hot, Margaret remembered. She'd burned her tongue on the first sip, and the pain had stayed with her all through Diane's careful speech about declining property values and rising taxes, and the burden of home maintenance at Margaret's age, at her age, as if 73 was ancient, as if she hadn't just cleaned out the gutters herself the week before. She had papers with her, Margaret said, all printed out, very official looking, spreadsheets, charts. She'd always been good with numbers, better than her brother, God rest him. Michael would have given you the shirt off his back, but ask him to balance a checkbook, and he'd look at you like you'd asked him to perform surgery. The social worker made a soft sound. What could something between sympathy and encouragement? Margaret hated it, hated being someone who needed encouraging, like a child learning to ride a bike. The house was worth too much to just sit on, Diane said, as if I was sitting on it like some dragon hoarding gold instead of living in it, living in the place where I'd raised her, where she'd had every birthday party, every Christmas morning, every milestone. Margaret's hands were shaking. They'd been shaking a lot lately, but not from age. From anger, from the kind of rage that had nowhere to go because the person you were angry at was your own child. And what did that make you? She talked about assisted living, Margaret said. The words tasted bitter. Very nice places, she assured me. Communities, with activities and medical staff on site, and people my own age. As if being my own age was some kind of condition that needed treatment. Outside, Alice's hedge clippers had fallen silent. Margaret remembered noticing that, the sudden absence of sound, like the world was holding its breath. That's when she put the document in front of me. Power of attorney, she said. Just a formality. Just to make things easier, Mom. Just so I can help you manage things. You trust me, don't you? The question had hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. You trust me, don't you? As if trust was something you could demand instead of earn. As if the answer was so obvious it didn't even need to be spoken aloud. Margaret had picked up the pen. She remembered that part clearly. The weight of it in her hand, the cool metal of the clip against her fingers. She'd even uncapped it when that small decisive click that felt like stepping off a cliff. I was going to sign it, Margaret said softly. I want you to know that. I was actually going to do it. Because she was my daughter, and because it's easier to trust than to question, and because I was tired, so tired of making decisions, of being responsible for everything, of being alone in this big house with its creaky floors, and its leaking faucets, and its memories in every corner. She'd held that pen poised over the signature line for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. And then Alice's cat had yowled in the backyard, a sound like murder, and the spell broke. I told her I needed to think about it, Margaret said. Just a few days, I said, to read it over properly, to maybe have my friend Janet's son look at it. He's a lawyer, I mentioned. Hans, just to be safe. The change in Diane's face had been subtle but unmistakable, like a mask slipping, just for a moment, before being carefully repositioned. Of course, Mom, Diane had said, her voice still honey-sweet, but with something else underneath, something metallic. Take all the time you need. It's a big decision. But her hand, when she'd reached for the document, had moved too quickly, too possessively, like she was afraid Margaret might change her mind about giving it back. She left right after that, Margaret said. Didn't finish her coffee, said she had a meeting. I watched her from the window getting into that BMW she'd leased. Not bought, leased, which seemed important somehow. She sat in the car for a long time before driving away. Just sat there, looking at her phone, her face all lit up by the screen. Margaret had stood at that window for an hour after Diane left, watching the street, watching the day fade into evening, watching her own reflection gradually appear in the glass, like a ghost materializing. I called Janet that night, Margaret said. Told her everything. She was quiet for a long time after I finished, and then she said, Maggie, do me a favor. Don't sign anything. Not yet. Let me make some calls. The social worker was writing faster now. Margaret wondered what she was putting down. Wondered if there was some box on some form for family betrayal or daughter who sees mother as burden rather than person. Janet's son called me the next morning, Margaret said. He was very careful with his words, very professional. He asked if I'd given Diane permission to access any of my accounts, wanting to make decisions on my behalf, to represent me in any legal or financial matters. Margaret had said no to all of it. No, no, no. A litany of negatives that somehow felt like the first positive thing she'd said in months. That's good, Mrs. Chen, he'd said. That's very good. And then he'd asked me something that made my blood run cold. He asked if Diane had a key to my house. Of course she did. She'd had one since she was 12 years old. A little brass key on a keychain shaped like a heart that Margaret had given her for her birthday. My big girl, Margaret had said, presenting it to her. Old enough for her own house key. I changed the locks that afternoon, Margaret said. Called a locksmith. Paid extra for same-day service. I felt ridiculous doing it. Paranoid. Like I was being dramatic. Like those women in the crime documentaries who suspect their own families of plotting against them. But the locksmith had been kind. Hadn't asked questions when Margaret requested he change all the locks, front and back, even the one to the garage. Had simply done the work, handed her 3 shiny new keys, and wished her a good day. Diane showed up 2 days later, Margaret said. I wasn't home. I was at the grocery store. Alice told me about it later. Said she saw Diane's car in the driveway, saw her trying her key in the lock, trying it again and again, like maybe she was using it wrong. Like maybe the lock was broken instead of changed. Alice had watched from her window as Diane had pulled out her phone, probably calling Margaret, probably wondering where she was and why she wasn't answering. Margaret's phone had been in her purse, on a buzzing away while she stood in the produce section, comparing apples and trying not to think about her daughter's face when she'd realized she'd been locked out of her own childhood home. Except it wasn't her home anymore, was it? If it ever really had been. Children grew up and moved out and built their own lives, and the houses they left behind were supposed to remain as museums to their youth, always accessible, never changing, waiting for them to return whenever they needed to remember who they used to be. She called 12 times that day, Margaret said. 12. I counted. I didn't answer any of them. I couldn't. I didn't know what to say. Sorry I changed the locks, honey, but I think you might be planning to steal my house. Hi, darling. Just protecting myself from my own daughter? The voicemails had started friendly. Concerned. Mom, just checking in. Give me a call when you get this. By the sixth one, the concern had sharpened into something else. Mom, I'm worried about you. Please call me back. This isn't like you. By the 12th, the pretense had dropped entirely. I don't know what's going on, but this is childish. We need to talk. Call me. I didn't call her, Margaret said. I called Janet instead. Told her about the locksmith, about the phone calls. She was quiet again, that same long silence. And then she said something I'll never forget. She said, "Trust your gut, Maggie. Mothers always know." But did they? Margaret had spent 3 weeks asking herself that question. 3 weeks of ignoring Diane's calls, of peeking through the curtains whenever a car slowed down in front of the house, of jumping every time the phone rang. 3 weeks of feeling like a prisoner in her own home, or a fugitive, or both. That's when the letter came, Margaret said. From a real estate attorney I'd never heard of. Very official, very formal. It informed me that the property at my address had been sold, and that I needed to vacate within 30 days. The social worker stopped writing. Looked up. Her eyes were wide. Sold, Margaret repeated. My house. The house I'd lived in for 42 years. The house Robert and I had bought when Diane was just a baby, when the neighborhood was still new and the trees were saplings and everything felt possible. Sold. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. They'd moved past shaking into something else, something colder and harder and more certain. I called the attorney, Margaret said. Told him there must be some mistake. I hadn't sold my house. I hadn't signed anything. He was very apologetic, very confused. He said he'd handled the entire transaction with my daughter, who had power of attorney, who had provided all the necessary documentation, who had signed everything on my behalf. Margaret had felt the room tilt then, felt the floor become unreliable beneath her feet, had sat down hard in Robert's old chair and gripped the armrests until her knuckles turned white. I told him I'd never granted power of attorney to anyone, she said. There was a long pause. And then he asked me to hold, please, just for a moment. And Margaret had held, sitting there in that chair with the phone pressed to her ear, listening to hold music that sounded like it was being played underwater, thinking about Diane as a little girl, how she used to bring Margaret dandelions from the yard and call them flowers, how her face would light up when Robert came home from work, how she'd wanted to be a veterinarian, and then a teacher, and then an astronaut before finally settling on finance, which had seemed so practical, so sensible, so safe. When the attorney came back on the line, his voice had changed. Professional distance replaced by something that might have been pity, might have been anger on her behalf, might have been both. Mrs. Chen, he'd said, I'm going to need you to come to my office, tomorrow if possible, and bring any documentation you have regarding this alleged power of attorney. Alleged. The word had felt like a life raft. I brought everything, Margaret told the social worker now. My will, my bank statements, every piece of paper Diane had ever given me to sign, going back years, birthday cards, Christmas cards. That birthday card she'd sent me last year with a handwritten note that said, You mean everything to me, Mom. Everything. The attorney had been younger than Margaret expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a way of listening that made you feel like whatever you were saying actually mattered. He'd spread all her documents across his conference table like pieces of a puzzle, methodical and careful. And the power of attorney document I'd been shown? Margaret said. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at me and asked if I recognized my signature at the bottom. She'd looked at it, really looked at it this time, and not just glanced the way she had in her kitchen while Diane smiled and poured coffee and talked about how this was all for the best. The signature was close, very close. The M in Margaret had the same loop. The C in Chen had the same decisive angle. But it wasn't mine, Margaret said. The H was wrong. I always make my H's with a little tail. Have ever since 3rd grade when Mrs. Patterson taught us cursive. Robert used to tease me about it. Said my H's looked like they were trying to run away from the rest of the letters. The attorney had pulled out a magnifying glass. Actually pulled out a magnifying glass like something from a detective movie and studied the signature under the light. Forged, he'd said finally. Poorly but cleverly. Close enough to pass a casual inspection, especially in a transaction handled entirely remotely. When your daughter was banking on no one looking too closely, Margaret had felt something crack open inside her then. Not her heart, that had already been broken. Something else. Something like understanding, or acceptance, or the death of a particular kind of hope. He asked if I wanted to press charges, Margaret said. Forgery, fraud, elder abuse. That's what they call it, apparently, when your own child steals from you. Elder abuse. As if I was some helpless victim instead of a grown woman who'd simply made the mistake of loving her daughter too much to suspect her. The social worker's pen had stopped moving entirely. She was just listening now, her professional mask slipping enough for Margaret to see the woman beneath it. Someone who maybe had children of her own. When someone who was trying to imagine what she was hearing and finding it impossible. I said no, Margaret said. Not to pressing charges. Not yet. First, I wanted to talk to her. The attorney advised against it. Said anything I said could complicate legal proceedings. But I didn't care about legal proceedings. I cared about looking my daughter in the eye and asking her why. Diane had agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory, Margaret had insisted. Not the house, which no longer felt safe. Not Diane's pristine apartment, where Margaret had never felt comfortable among all that expensive minimalist furniture. Somewhere public, somewhere they'd have to keep their voices down and their faces civil. She was already there when I arrived, Margaret said, looking at her phone, hammering that same concentrated expression she'd had sitting in her car that day. She looked up when I walked in, and for just a second, I saw fear in her eyes. Real fear. And then it was gone, replaced by that practiced smile. They'd ordered coffee, regular coffee this time, not the expensive kind, and sat across from each other in a booth by the window. Outside, people walked past living their normal lives, their uncomplicated lives, their lives that probably didn't include having to confront their children about attempted theft. I asked her straight out, Margaret said, "Did you forge my signature? Did you try to sell my house without my permission?" Diane had looked at her for a long time, long enough for Margaret to notice things she'd never noticed before. The tightness around her daughter's eyes, the way her jaw clenched, and the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted her coffee cup. She didn't deny it, Margaret said softly. That's what surprised me most. I'd expected lies, excuses, justifications. But she just set down her cup and said, yes. One word, 2 letters. Yes. Like it was simple, like it was nothing. Then she started talking, Margaret said, about debt, about the BMW lease and the apartment rent and the credit cards and the investments that hadn't panned out, about how she'd borrowed money from her company, just temporarily, just until she could pay it back. But things had gotten complicated, about how she'd needed a way to fix everything before anyone found out. And Margaret had sat there listening to her daughter explain, in careful detail, how she'd planned to steal her mother's home, how she'd practiced Margaret's signature, how she'd found a buyer through a colleague who wouldn't ask too many questions, how she'd planned to use the money to solve all her problems. And then, this part delivered with something almost like sincerity, she'd planned to help Margaret find a nice apartment somewhere smaller, somewhere more manageable. As if that made it better, Margaret said, as if stealing from me was somehow an act of love because she'd planned to give me back some scraps afterward. The social worker made a sound. Might have been a word. Might have been just air leaving her lungs in disbelief. I asked her how long she'd been planning it, Margaret said. She didn't answer, just looked out the window. So I asked her something else. I asked her if she loved me. Diane had flinched then. Actually physically flinched, like Margaret had struck her. So, of course I love you, she'd said. You're my mother. And I told her that love wasn't supposed to look like this, Margaret said. That I'd loved her enough to raise her alone after Robert died. Loved her enough to work 2 jobs to pay for her college. Loved her enough to never ask for anything back. Never make her feel obligated. Never use my sacrifices as weapons. That's what love looked like to me. Not this. Never this. Margaret had stood up then, leaving her coffee untouched, leaving Diane sitting there with her excuses and her debt and her choices. "I didn't press charges," Margaret said. "The attorney was disappointed, but I couldn't do it. She's still my daughter. That doesn't change, no matter what she did. But I did have him send her a letter. Very formal, very legal, stating that any attempt to contact me, either to access my property or to represent herself as having any authority over my affairs, would be met with immediate legal action." 3 months had passed since that coffee shop meeting. 3 months of silence from Diane. 3 months of Margaret living in her house, with her name on the deed and her memories in every room, without looking over her shoulder. "Janet convinced me to come talk to you," Margaret said to the social worker. "Said I needed to tell someone official what happened. For the record," she said, "in case Diane tries anything else." The social worker nodded slowly. "I'm glad you did. What you've described is financial exploitation, and there are resources—" "I don't want resources," Margaret interrupted, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I don't want support groups or counseling or protective services. I just wanted someone to know. Someone official. Someone who could write it down and file it away somewhere. So if anything ever happens to me, people will know it wasn't an accident." She stood up, suddenly exhausted. The telling had taken something out of her, something she couldn't name but could feel the absence of. "The strange thing is," Margaret said, pulling on her coat, "I'm not angry anymore. I was for a while. Furious. The kind of anger that keeps you up at night making imaginary speeches and winning imaginary arguments. But it passed. Now I just feel sad. Sad that she became someone who could do this. Sad that I raised someone who could look at her mother and see a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved." The social worker stood too, gathering her papers. "Mrs. Chen, before you go, I have to ask, how are you doing? Really doing?" Margaret considered the question, considered the house she'd returned to, still hers, still standing, considered Alice next door, with her hedge clippers and her nosiness that had turned out to be neighborly concern. Considered Janet and her son and their protective fury on her behalf. Considered the locksmith who'd changed her locks without judgment. Considered all the small kindnesses that had held her up when her own daughter had tried to take her home. "I'm okay," Margaret said and meant it. "I'm 73 years old. I live alone in a house too big for one person. My daughter tried to steal from me, and I lost whatever relationship we might have salvaged. But I'm okay, because I still have the house, I still have my friends, I still have my dignity. And I learned something important." "What's that?" "That family isn't always blood," Margaret said. "Sometimes it's the neighbor who notices when something's wrong. Sometimes it's the friend who tells you to trust your gut. Sometimes it's the attorney who gets angry on your behalf, or the locksmith who works on a Saturday, or the social worker who listens to an old woman ramble for hours." She paused at the door, her hand on the knob, looking back at this woman who'd listened without judgment, without pity, without trying to fix anything. "Diane sent me a card last week," Margaret said. "No return address. It said, 'I'm sorry' on the front. Inside she'd written, 'I hope someday you can forgive me.' Did you write back?" Margaret shook her head. "I didn't throw it away either. I put it in a drawer with all the other cards she sent over the years. The birthday cards and Mother's Day cards and all those cards that said I was loved. Maybe someday I'll look at them and remember the good times. Remember the daughter she used to be before she became the person who tried to steal my house." She opened the door, stepped halfway through, then turned back one last time. "Or maybe I won't," she said quietly. "Maybe I'll just remember that I survived. That when someone I loved tried to take everything from me, I didn't let them. Not because I was strong or brave or knew what I was doing, but because a cat yowled at the right moment and I trusted my gut and I had people who cared about me enough to help." The social worker smiled, sad but genuine. "That sounds like enough." "Yes," Margaret said. "I think it is." She walked out into the afternoon sunshine, toward her car, toward her house, toward her life that continued despite everything. Alice would probably be in her garden. Janet would probably call later to see how the meeting went. The house would need groceries and the guest room needed painting, and there were 1,000 small tasks waiting that had nothing to do with Diane or betrayal or forgiveness. Margaret got in her car, started the engine, and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. Through the windshield, she could see the office building's reflection, could see herself reflected in it too, blurry and indistinct. She thought about the power of attorney documents she'd almost signed, thought about how close she'd come to losing everything, thought about Diane sitting in her BMW, face lit by her phone screen, on it making plans that didn't include Margaret except as a problem to be solved. Then she put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the reflection behind, heading toward home. Toward the house with the blue wallpaper flowers and Robert's ugly chair, and 42 years of memories that belonged to her and no one else. The sun was warm through the windshield. Her hands were steady on the wheel, and somewhere in the distance, probably in her garden, Alice's hedge clippers were singing their patient song. Clip, 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 like a heartbeat, like time passing, like the sound of a life continuing, imperfect and complicated in hers.